Right, here we are again, back at Speaker's Corner. You're here with me, Ian McPherson, and Finn Hagen, and we got two other guests sitting down with us. We have...
My name is Mehran, nice to meet you.
My name is Nicholas.
Nicholas. And we're here, we're just going to discuss, basically, we're just going to talk about what's wrong with the world, or what's not right with the world, whichever. But we're just going to go into a general kind of debate and discussion and kind of free flow. And I think we could kick it off with Finn. Maybe you got something to say about, maybe, we was discussing last time, we was talking about the soldiers, isn't it, really? And I was going to take a position of the, yeah, the good guy, and you're the bad.
But how do you know who the good guy is, and how do you know who the bad guy is? If the good guy's telling you all the things that you want to hear, and the bad guy's telling you all the things you don't want to hear, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy?
I think the good guy is the person, always the person who goes in with a clean, honest heart, with honest thinking, you know, with naivety almost sometimes. You know, anybody who's doing something kind of underhand and malicious, or is aware of the bigger plan, I see that as the bad guy. But it's
90% of the human race, or what's described as the human race.
Yeah.
Most of these people.
Sometimes you can get good guys who are being manipulated. For example, in Syria, you've got a lot of different groups. Some of them are mercenaries. Some of them are genuinely people who are fed up and are genuinely nice people who think that they're doing the right thing. But they're involved with some very nasty people that are situations that they don't understand because they're being manipulated for purposes that they don't understand. So you can have good guys being on the wrong side of a cause. You know, you can have good causes, bad causes, but sometimes good guys unfortunately get manipulated.
How do you know if a politician's lying?
When he moves his lips?
That's right. Remember, they're moving their lips.
Yeah.
Every one of them are working for the government. Every one of them get their money from the government. They don't get their money off me and you. We don't pay politicians. The government pays them. Government gets what the government pays for. Accept any benefit, reward, or privilege of any form of government, either civil or ecclesiastical, and you'll lose your independence. You'll lose your God-given rights. You'll accept privileges.
all right. Let's just roll this back a bit because, like, you know, the way we did kick it off, like, I'm going to take this position of this good soldier, and you know, I don't. It's kind of hard to put those two words together because, you know, it's like a good killer almost you're putting down. But the naivety in the young soldiers, and the way I see it, it's kind of similar. It's a similar model which they have up north now, which they have in America for a long time, which is to make poor people, poor young people, who have no chance of probably getting a decent education or getting very far in life, be forced or kind of coaxed into joining the military to get a better education, have a so-called better life. And I'm seeing, you know, it's been pushed over it quite heavily. And, you know, I've seen it in America quite heavily, where my friends who have come from a very poor background in Brooklyn, and so to speak, and they can't pay to get into college, to get an education, to better themselves, and the only way is to join the reserves and join the army, so they can get the army to pay for their education, and so they can move up through the ranks. But you know, eventually they get sent off to Syria and Iraq, and or they go AWOL, or they come back with some kind of mental, you know, trauma.
You got mental health problems. Thing is, if you look at the cenotaphs, First and Second World War, and the lists of young men that had laid down their lives, as it says in the contract, they laid down their lives, they sacrificed their souls. You know, it's all contractual. They're all privates and corporals. Very few sergeants, almost no captains. I've never seen a colonel, and you're never going to see a general on a cenotaph's name. You know what I mean? Very few of them have been killed in battle. There was one actually once, a battle where a general accidentally got killed by enemy fire. It was just a stray cannonball or whatever, you know. And they stopped all the battles stopped, and everybody rushed around and get it, because both sides were actually operating on the same thing, you know. When you look at Nelson, and he's standing like that, and you look at Napoleon, and he's standing like that. I know Nelson supposedly had an arm missing. But at the end of the day, they both had the same hats that way and that way. They were telling you we're in the same. It was the order of the paw, or the lion's paw. They're on the same side. That's why they use the double-headed eagle as their representation.
Your background is more to do with Syria, you were saying.
Well, I'm getting my overall understanding of what's been happening from the research I've done in the past 20 years is that there's an attempt to take over the financial, military, political resources of the planet. And that attempt is through an Anglo-American elite together with bankers in the West. So there are countries that don't want to play ball. And the countries that don't want to play ball are primarily Russia and China, Iran, and a few others. Because these countries, the banking systems, are independent, they don't take orders. The politicians don't take their orders from Washington or from London. And the Anglo-American elite can't stand that. So they have to destroy them. And previously, through the right-wingers like George Bush, the neocons, the policy was to intervene directly, to have direct intervention. But when that policy was failed, basically what's happened is the neoliberals have taken over and they want to destroy these countries from within. They want to destroy Syria, Iran and Russia from within. So when you hear stories such as there's trouble in Georgia, there's trouble brewing in Lebanon or Syria, you know it's the hand of the West, the hand of Israel, Mossad, Western agencies that want to destroy these countries from within.
When you're saying about the West, what you're describing is Western banking systems.
That's right.
The
government within the government.
The
government within the government, because even the senators and the congressmen in America.
Government, that's a good name for it.
That's right.
So how do they benefit? How does the West actually benefit?
If you, for example, do some research in terms of the gap between the extremely rich, the middle class, and the poor in America, you see the 1% in America have benefited massively. There's been a massive transfer of resources from the poor and the middle class to the 1%. So rather than the traditional talk of class warfare between the poor and the middle class, it's now become the 1% against the 99%. So, for example, you look at the demonstrations around the world, for example, Occupy Wall Street, Occupy this, Occupy that, all over France, Spain, Greece. People understand that it's the elite, the oligarch, versus the rest of the population. It's no longer the middle class against the working class. So this is what's happened. There's been a massive transfer of resources. One of the phases of that massive transfer was 2008, where around the world something like $14 trillion got transferred from the population, from the poorest of the population, to elite banks. Even when they say we're going to bail you out, what happens is they print money, the EU prints money in Frankfurt and then gives it to banks at 0% interest. They don't give it to the population. So when they print 100 billion euros, that 100 billion euros, you would think that when it's given to Spain, for example, it would push inflation up. But it doesn't push inflation up. The reason being, it doesn't get into the economy. It doesn't get into the pockets of people. It gets into the banks. The 100 billion is given to the banks at 0% interest. The banks are by law can multiply that by 10 and then lend it sometimes up to 20. That's right. They can, when you pay up to 30% on your credit card, that bank has borrowed that money at 0%, and then the depositors.
Can I just say, it's not your money.
It's created out of thin air.
But it's not your bank. It's not your country. It's not your world. No. People are under this delusion.
Criminal gangsters.
Yeah.
I mean, there's been, you know, everybody has been pointing the finger at banking systems and saying, you know, the divide has become a lot wider. I mean, it's been evident for a long time, whether it's the information divide or whether it's the computer divide or whether it's the social divide. But it seems like all the divisions have become a lot wider in this day and age. And what is the benefit of creating such a division continuously? Wouldn't it just lead to some kind of, you know, chaos or some uproar within civil society? Won't people become uncivil after a while if the masses are totally divided, I mean, and suppressed, and the division's so great, isn't it going to just have the adverse effect? Or is this what they really want? How about, would you?
Well, I think the masses have been bought off. Most people are sadly more interested in Manchester United or EastEnders in this country. They're more interested in eating junk food for junk people. They're more interested in shopping. They're more interested in trivia, stupid game shows. I think the human race in the advanced world is a bunch of walking zombies, quite frankly. I really mean that. I don't wish to have anything to do with them, and I think they're easy to be ruled by, the bankers, because they don't even discuss these things amongst themselves on the streets or in bars or here in Hyde Park.
I agree with that. I think just to connect, also people don't connect the dots. They don't understand that these events are all interconnected. They're interconnected, and because they don't connect the dots, they think these are independent events. Like, for example, they think that the bailing out of the banks is separate to, say, wars in Syria or Libya and so on. They don't understand that these things are all interconnected, and there's a plan to actually take over the resources.
Saying about bailing out the banks. Hang on a second. It's the banks that are bailing out the countries.
Yes.
You got to understand. The government gets what the government pays for.
It's the biggest confidence trick in history. You see, just to take one country like Ireland, the two major banks, Allied Irish and Anglo-Irish Bank, these are the banks that have their decisions have caused 70 to 100 billion euros of debt. Now that debt, instead of the banks paying that debt was transferred to the population of Ireland. So now the 5 million people of Ireland now owe that debt. Instead of those two banks owing that debt, the people of Ireland owe that debt. So what's happened is private debt has become public debt. By transferring private debt, misused by criminal corporations, criminal banksters, instead of them going to jail, what they've done is they've transferred that debt to the population. So now the population have been indebted, and the way to get that money back is through things like cutting back services, austerity, and so on. If people understood that austerity is actually about making up the mistakes of the banks, it's nothing to do with overspending, you see. If corporations paid their just taxes, even if they paid 5% tax, we wouldn't have to cut benefits, because most of the big corporations pay zero tax, absolutely zero tax. If you look at, for example, the biggest corporations in America, General Electric, they paid zero tax. Not only they paid zero tax, they got some money from the government. You see, if somebody earns £100,000, they would have to pay 50% tax, but the corporation making several $100 billion and several tens of billions of dollars in profit, they pay zero tax.
But remember, you don't pay tax, it's taken from you.
It's taken from you. But if you're talking about fairness, how is it a person on 100,000 pay 50% and corporation pays zero tax?
I understand that. I saw something quite recently about the tax breaks in America. If you employ over 20 employees or something like that, you get a bigger tax break. And it doesn't really help the small businessman who's trying to struggle to get up. So it's really kind of a lose-lose situation.
They've talked about Starbucks and a couple of corporations.
Bucks for the star, Bucks for the star, Starbucks.
These are small fish. You're talking about the biggest corporations on planet Earth.
Do you know where the word
nothing?
Do you know where the word scot-free comes from? The Scots don't pay tax. They don't recognise any government that would ask tax from it. I mean, you've been up against the tax man for about the last 2,300 years. It's coming out of Rome. It's coming out of the Vatican. It's like once you understand who the enemy really is, even the Bank of Rome is the Bank of America. And the Bank of America is run by the Bank of England, whose sign is a red cross on a white background. That's the sign of Christus Vicaris Filii Dei. In hoc signans, in this sign you shall conquer. He wasn't talking about the armies of the world, he was talking about the financial mechanisms. Those that couldn't be murdered were bought and sold. Those that couldn't be bought and sold were discredited. Those that couldn't be discredited were just murdered.
Okay, so what's the solutions, or what's the possible outcomes in 10 years' time?
Well, I think it'll carry on much the same. I think it's a sad reflection upon humanity that considers itself an intelligent being But we can all, the whole of the human race can agree that there's so much wrong in the world, so much wrong, where people, you know, in parts of the world they don't have enough food, and yet 2 hours drive you can go to people who are obese and 25 stone, where there are people who accumulate vast sums of money and have bizarre levels of wealth, while 1 in 8 people in the world, or whatever it is, outside of Europe live in destitute situations. And it's all justified through the democratically elected politicians. What staggers me most of all is that people actually vote. They vote for a mindless moron in a suit who speaks well.
We're here sitting in Speaker's Corner, and this place traditionally used to be packed with people as far as the eye could see. Even 100 years, 120 years ago, when we had the First World War, there was talk that this is the war to end all wars. They talked about the First World War as the
years ago, yeah.
That's right. And the First World War, there was so much disappointment in the upper classes, so much disappointment in the people who made the decisions, because they said, look, your decisions have led to deaths of 10 to 15 million deaths, out of which we've actually achieved nothing. And this must be the war to end wars. And then look what we've had since. We've had war after, we've had the Second World War, we've had even the people have got very short memory. The Vietnam War in the 60s, people thought there was a new awakening, a new consciousness, the new age of Aquarius, where people are going to stand together and say, America is not going to bully third world countries. America is not going to drop chemical bombs, Agent Orange and things like that. And there was an awakening. People thought there was an awakening on the planet, a planet-wide awakening, and that was 40 years ago. And look what's happened. We've had Iraq, which is exactly the same situation, but the players are different. The scenario is the same, but the players are different. So you've got Saddam Hussein, just like Ho Chi Minh. You've got carpet bombing of Iraq. You've got the destruction of Iraq. You've got nothing has changed. You know, 120 years ago we thought this come to an end, and then every generation the same thing is repeated and repeated and repeated.
Playing words, carpet bombing.
Yeah,
carpet. Oh, like it's going to lie down here and just relax on the carpet.
People have not. There's this famous saying: is if you don't learn from your mistakes, you're bound to repeat them. So America did not learn their mistake from Vietnam. They repeated it in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Now they're repeating it in Syria.
But it's big business. You know, I heard that you know, the third largest business is oil. The second largest business is the drug business, and the first largest business is war. I mean, you just imagine you make these things which destroy people, destroy countries, which you got to rebuild, and plus you got to make more bullets in order to replace the ones you fired and the bombs.
This just described as called G-O-D, gold, oil and drugs. You go to war to get gold. You go to war so that you can distribute drugs and the pharmaceuticals and the illegal drugs, and oil is the mechanism, oil is the flux on which it flows.
That's what Afghanistan's about, really.
Of course, but also these things are two ways. We can point the blame at politicians, or which we can, but also you've got to look at the population. When is the population going to grow up and wake up? When is each generation says this is each generation
live in a technological age where, you know, every one of us can access information at a touch of a button. Now you could excuse the human race for being zombies in the, say, before 1945. We could say they were tribalist morons fighting one another. But now where we all know generally a little bit more about every other part of the world than our ancestors ever did, and yet people are still tribalist morons.
The one thing about the First World War and the Second World War, after it occurred, the demographics on world population went from there to there. Strangely enough, if you were in control of the world, which these guys are, right? Remember that they're not thinking human in the way that we would understand human thought. These guys are at think tank level, right? They're above government, they're above human intelligence. If you look around, I'm sorry to say, but you know, you go to the countryside, there's not a badger left, there's no rabbits, there's no trees.
There's no sparrows anymore. I've noticed. I used to like observing sparrows as a little boy, and they've all disappeared.
They've moved out. They totally moved out. What I've found in this day and age is that, okay, we're living in an information society, and it's an informed society. I've done my whole dissertation on this whole era, and all these things being ushered in, and it's quite interesting. But one of the things what kept on popping out as a word, which I thought would be a reoccurring word in this era, is accountability. Now, with the influx of information technology and computers and stuff like that, it dissolves accountability, because you cannot place your finger on who's truly accountable. They always will point it at the computer and say it's a glitch in the system in some way or another. There is no and we diffuse ourselves from accountability because we're representing ourselves online as avatars or some other user-based names, and in the real world, while the real world's getting pillaged. And
Information Act as well, right? Which means that for 100 years you aren't going to be able to find out who it really was that pushed the button.
why is that?
Because the people are still alive. These guys
It's a generational thing.
generational. They live in timelines and in bloodlines outside our perception. The guys that are pushing these buttons, you're never going to get their names.
It's really sad, because it's why I really enjoy talking to really old people like pensioners when they tell me about the past. They really tell you about what it was like, and the real problems and stuff like that, which the younger people will not listen to the old people. They will go, oh, he's talking rubbish, don't want to listen to him and that and stuff, and it gets dissolved and it gets lost, information gets lost, and that's part of that curse, not remembering. Yeah.
Take the example of Vietnam. You see, the Vietnam War, America's involvement was Bay of Tonkin, you see, and it was believed then. And then many years later, when it was found out that it was based on a lie, and that the Bay of Tonkin incident was actually the Americans firing on the Vietnamese, not the other way around, and the Vietnamese didn't fire back. Yet the president presented that in Congress as if they had fired on them, and that started the American involvement. Now that truth, many years later, it came tiny little bit of a column on some inside page. Yet people don't pay any interest. Once that war got started, they were so involved in the mass murdering of the Vietnamese, the mass carpet bombing of the Vietnamese. That war took many, many years, some 10, 15, 12 years that war took.
You know, it was Jim Morrison's father that was on that boat in the Bay of Tonkin to give the orders. Jim Morrison's father, yeah, the singer, who actually supposedly died. Also, Jimi Hendrix's father was a Royal Navy officer, Scottish Royal Navy officer, who died. All you got, John Lennon died. These guys have came out and said, well, look, listen, what you thought they were the good guys that were writing all this beautiful music? What if that music was actually wrote by the soul dyers that had come subversively to destroy a nation? Do you know, forget war, do you know how many people are dead and have become killed because they haven't reproduced, because of the hippie explosion, the drug culture, the Timothy Leary, Time of the Leary. A Leary was a lamplighter, by the way, an illuminator. Time of the Leary.